You may begin.
George Mason describes slavery in 1773 as that slow poison which is daily contaminating the minds and morals of our people, to regard a part of our own species in this most abject and contemptible degree below us. The 1863 Emancipation Proclamation proved to be a distinct turning point in the fight to rid the nation of this evil. However, to be constitutionally justifiable, the document was issued out of a military necessity rather than a moral idealism, hence why it was severely limited in its desired outcome of freeing slaves, but effective in winning the war for the Union.
Despite the intent of the Emancipation Proclamation to free an entire class of people, its limited reach and effectiveness when compared to other American documents of social reform lead us to disagree with Don E. Fehrenbacher's assertion that the Proclamation is the greatest document of social reform in American history. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation out of military necessity. As a result, very few slaves were actually freed by the measure, leading historian Lonnie Bunch to recently describe it as the most misunderstood document in American history.
Comparatively, in providing true emancipation, citizenship, basic due process, equal protection rights, and universal male suffrage, the Reconstruction Amendments had a far greater impact. Similarly, the Declaration of Independence incited a social and political revolution resulting in the creation of the United States itself. Though it acted as a catalyst for later, more successful attempts to eradicate slavery, the Proclamation itself did not provide a large enough impact to truly be considered the greatest example of social reform in the United States.
Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles described as a new departure for the president, Lincoln found that as a matter of military necessity, we must free the slaves or be ourselves subdued. Pressured by abolitionists and new battlefield reports detailing the key role of slaves in the Southern effort, as well as a need to redefine the war for greater domestic and international support, President Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. While Lincoln had previously been against such a measure, as he felt that it would be unconstitutional, he now embraced it as a means of saving the Union.
To justify this questionable action, Lincoln firmly rooted the proclamation to his Article II power as Commander-in-Chief by describing it as an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity. Further justification for the order was also found in Lincoln's powers as the Chief Executive to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, a power that gave Lincoln the ability to enforce congressional actions like the 1861 and 1862 Confiscation Acts. Furthermore, the Supreme Court would essentially found Lincoln's proclamation to be constitutional after the fact in Youngstown Sheet and Tuco v. Sawyer, when it differentiated between Lincoln's actions as Commander-in-Chief and President Harry Truman's executive order to nationalize the steel industry.
Despite hardly freeing any slaves, the Emancipation Proclamation still had significant repercussions for American constitutionalism, in that it wiped out private property worth millions. Many saw this as a clear violation of the Fifth Amendment Takings Clause, or in the even more extreme opinion of historian R.R. Palmer, as an annihilation of individual property rights without parallel in the history of the Western world. However, in the period before the Emancipation Proclamation, a number of offers to compensate slave owners who abandoned the rebellion were made, while the proclamation itself contained a clause that all citizens of the United States who have remained loyal shall be compensated for all losses, including the loss of slaves.
The Captures Clause of the Constitution further justified the proclamation in that it allowed Congress to make rules concerning captures on land or water. Since the proclamation was itself a wartime measure, it was hardly a stretch to see the uncompensated taking of rebel property as justifiable under this clause of the Constitution. By seceding, the South had abandoned American constitutionalism, so the Fifth Amendment could hardly be said to apply to them, a fact reflected by a previous statement made by President Lincoln that such constitutional principles apply only in this country and not to states in rebellion against the Constitution.
In a letter to a fellow Republican senator, Charles Sumner described President Lincoln's purpose to do what he can to carry forward the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln's mission bears a striking parallel to President Barack Obama's modern efforts to give homosexuals equal rights, a fact perhaps best reflected in the reliance of the President's second inaugural address. Thank you.
458 with a lot of coughs and sniffles and hums and all that sorts of stuff. So, okay, Dan, do you want to lead off?
Yes. Do you think a recognition proclamation would do for gays and lesbians today what the Emancipation Proclamation did for slaves? Explain your answer.
Well, I don't believe that there would be much justification for a recognition proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued out of military necessity. If a similar proclamation was issued to essentially ensure that states would not violate the rights of homosexuals, then I think it would be difficult to justify constitutionally.
In addition, it's unlikely that any president would use so much political capital on something that's already being adopted by many states across the country. Essentially, if you look to the way that our laboratory of democracy is working, it's really pointing towards marriage equality by itself. So a recognition proclamation, so to speak, would really just add fuel to a political fire.
Would the Emancipation Proclamation be upheld today under Youngstown Sheet 2B Sawyer?
If we act under the assumption that it was still for military necessity, it might be. The differentiation that the Supreme Court made in Youngstown was that the Emancipation Proclamation was required because of a very direct and very immediate military necessity. Nationalization of the steel companies, however, was not as immediate and not as direct of a threat to national security or to the state of the Union itself.
Youngstown also defined where war was actually taking place, like what is being influenced by the war. So the entire southern states within this justification by Youngstown is that the entire South is a war zone and is affected by the military necessity. Whereas with the steel companies, they found that the steel companies were a domestic institution and were not affected by wartime.
What is this military necessity you're talking about with freeing slaves? Why was it a military necessity to free slaves in the southern states?
Well, the South relied extremely heavily on slaves throughout the war effort. And you think about our own efforts throughout wars to build up the industry, the war industry in the nation. And if you have a second workforce, such as the slaves, to take care of that, then you essentially double the size of your army. So taking away the South's slaves really strips them of their backbone.
You can also say it was kind of a circle, or a way to get around almost the takings clause, because since slaves were considered property at the time, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation to free those southern state slaves because there was no way for him to provide just compensation for them.
In addition, Lincoln really needed to create a cause for the war that wasn't just keeping the Union together. After the Battle of Antietam, he needed to find a greater purpose, and slavery was that purpose. With the Emancipation Proclamation, he could turn the focus of the war from being about preserving the Union to about eradicating slavery. And this not only created a higher purpose for which the Union could fight, but also would garner greater international support for the Union cause.
There are some who say that the Emancipation Proclamation was an example of the use of the bully pulpit, even though Theodore Roosevelt came many years after Lincoln, but it was an example of a president using the bully pulpit. Can you think of a modern day issue where President Obama should use the bully pulpit in the same manner that Lincoln used for the Emancipation Proclamation?
Absolutely. I'd say he needs to be far greater in his support for equal pay for women. I mean, he did sign the Lilly Ledbetter Equal Pay Act, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every company wishes to follow it. In fact, the Texas Supreme Court recently released a decision saying that it didn't believe that states, specifically the state government, should have to follow this idea of equal pay for equal work. As a result, I really believe that President Obama needs to be far more involved in his use of garnering support through his office for this idea.
Another region that I think Obama could really benefit from the bully pulpit is in gun rights. So basically, how the pattern has been over this past decade has been there's some massacre, some outrageous abuse of gun rights, and then all of a sudden the nation is outraged and they want to pass gun legislation, stuff like that, and then that fervor eventually dies down. So Obama should really use that opportunity to push through legislation that ensures that something like that doesn't happen again.
You know, slavery is not steel production. It's immoral, it's wrong, it's evil. Why couldn't Abraham Lincoln simply say, we're freeing all the slaves as a matter of just higher law, adherence to a higher law, and to the concept of natural rights? Why did he even need to, if we're talking about being in a theater of war, why does it even matter legally? You know, the Revolutionary War was illegal, so, and he obviously didn't care about habeas corpus in Maryland, so why did he care about the law here?
Well, in a letter to a fellow senator, he said that I must reject that I can play a role as a legislator on this matter. Lincoln was afraid of extending his executive power too far. This is contrary to what many Democrats at the time felt or thought about Lincoln. They thought that he was a tyrant. In fact, he was ensuring that he didn't abuse his office.
Time. Yeah, there you go. Sorry. 17 seconds. Sorry. Daniel, go ahead.
I thought that